Batu, Barada, Nikto.
You must remember those words.
Gordon's alive.
You know what the Turing test is?
I know Kung Fu.
Dead or alive, you are coming with me.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to Stories Out of Time and Space. I'm your regular host, Scott Weatherly, and always on this episode I will be joined by Julian Darius, and we have just finished Series 3. In the last episode I interjected just as we were about to jump onto Series 4. So here we are, ladies and gentlemen, another bonus episode. The review continues. We're now 4 episodes in, and here we are with Series 4 of Red Dwarf. I hope you enjoy it. And I'm going to hand you over to myself and Julian.
Yeah, I mean, and in fact, I think that's a great seg because Camille, which starts season 4, is all about Crichton and Crichton's development.
Yeah, well, actually, I'd say the first two are incredibly Crichton-centric episodes, aren't they?
Mm-hmm.
Because you get, they come to this notion of Crichton trying to accept who he is, working against the programming. The first two is Camille and DNA. Now Camille is sort of, this is the one that starts with them doing the what I think is one of the most famous and iconic moments of Red Dwarf is Lister trying to teach Crichton to lie.
Mm-hmm.
In the most basic sort of what is this? It's a banana. No, it's not a banana. It's a, Bolivian police officer or whatever they say. Sort of trying to get him just to say that it's not this, it's something else. And so he can eventually get around to calling Rimmer a smeghead, which is a great scene. And I love that scene. I think it's a really, really good scene between the two of them.
Absolutely.
But then he's obviously called off, and they go planet hopping, or whatever, and they come across a ship, and on that ship, Crichton, whilst there, meets another android, and again, but falls in love with her pretty much instantly. And this is again where we sort of get this notion of androids and emotions and all this other stuff, and it's sort of he's more than a robot, he's more than an android, really. But obviously, to cut it short, you find out that she's not an android. She's actually a Gelf, which is a pleasure Gelf, a genetically engineered life form. And she actually represents herself, or presents herself, as a person's most desired pleasure, lust, figure of lust, I suppose, is the way to put it, isn't it, really? So you get to see each of the Red Dwarf crew, what they really desire. What are your thoughts on that?
I like this episode quite a bit. I love that, Cat, for example, sees himself. I mean, that's so perfect. And as far as missed opportunities, when those opportunities aren't missed like that, they really land and really work. And I think that while this episode starts with that kind of teaching Crichton to lie and teaching him to get beyond his programming. Ultimately, Crichton, tells this pleasure Gelf that, no, she really is beautiful as a slime monster with an eye tentacle. This absolutely disgusting thing. Crichton takes the green blob for dinner, says, oh, it's an old story. Droid meets Blob, thinks the Blob is a droid, and it's all very funny. But that this is all unified through Casablanca, and the ending of Casablanca, of sort of lying can be noble, right? Which obviously was for a greater cause there, and sort of we got to stop the Nazis. But here, Crichton does it to spare this pleasure Gelf and her feelings. And of course, it's clever that it's like the 13th remake of Casablanca or something. Um,
Yeah.
but then also, the fact that if Crichton has, I mean, so I think the whole thing works as a piece, and I think that if Crichton has overcome his programming, it is to help somebody else.
Mm.
And in this case, a pleasure gelf who is a weird, disgusting alien that nobody should care about logically. Is the lowest of the low. And Crichton overcomes his programming to help a stranger who is kind of a rejected figure. I love that, and I think it kind of comes together as an episode, as a full statement on something.
Yeah, it's definitely a sort of again, I think, like you say, this series 4. We're maintaining a lot. The cast remain the same. You still, the crew are all there. I think they try something different with this series, where sort of like series 3 was very much about specific sort of like it was a sitcom. It's sitcom based sci-fi ideas. What situation can we put the crew in, and then sort of like see how they would react. With this series 4, I think there's a lot more thought put into. Obviously, it's all about the characters, but there's more thought about the sort of like the larger themes, of the sci-fi, like you say. So in this, it's this thing of like tolerance and acceptance. I mean, yeah, the scene where sort of she reveals herself as being as to what she actually looks like, and Crichton's like, "For a large green blob, you're a very attractive large green blob." And the cat's response is like, "Really? She looks like something that dropped out of a whale's nose." It's really sort of like and she's like, "He's right. I look hideous." Um, it's really sort of like I mean, we know the cat is very narcissistic, but like he's not holding back. He's like, and she's like, he's right. I'm hideous. Um, and you do find out that what the person, or the thing that Crichton ends up lying to her about, is the fact that she has another partner. She's married to someone in Gelf terms, and to this other thing, who's actually looking into a cure for their condition that will make them better. So he's sort of saying, look, you've got to go with him to make your life better. So he sort of sacrifices his own happiness. And it does. It feels like they're actually going for a theme in this episode. Like, they're not just setting it up for the jokes. Like, they really want to sort of try and say something with these characters and sort of with some of these ideas. And I think Camille's a really strong one to start with.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, and I think that there's a kind of maturity to this plot.
Mm.
And what I mean isn't necessarily, the humor. But I mean, we've seen the ways in which the show has advanced and kind of gotten beyond the original Odd Couple premise, and then, most recently added Crichton and kind of experimented with gross out humor. I guess there's a little bit of gross out humor here, just with that it's a blob and, it's so gross. But that it can kind of weave an episode that achieves that humor and also touches on those themes and gets at, something not only in Crichton's evolution, but also, maybe for this Gelf that, we've seen a million times these stories of like, not just here, but on Star Trek, of aliens that, turn into somebody's sexual desire or whatever.
Mm.
And there might be some sympathy for that alien, but ultimately, their job is to go away, and that's kind of true here. But it seems as if it's more of a mature episode to me.
Yeah, I agree. I think, like you said, the writing's definitely matured, and I think they really want to try and push this into being something more than a bit of a daft sort of sci-fi comedy, and to see if it can actually ask certain questions, or like you say, do some of that sort of Star Trek kind of stuff, but on a comedy, angle. And I think Camille's very successful at that. If anything, I think the first sort of 3 episodes in a row all sort of do that. And if we do jump to DNA, I mean, the one thing I would point out, actually, talking about Camille, one thing worth noting is when we talked about Kachansky sort of being dropped from the whole sort of thing. When Lister gets to see his perfect object of perfect desire, it's not Kachansky.
Right.
It's someone sort of like she's an attractive sort of early '90s sort of a similar version of Dave Lister, and so it's interesting to note that Kachansky is sort of out of mind by this sort of point, which sort of goes back to our point before that she was just a passing fad, really.
Yeah, he doesn't really care about her, really. I mean, she'll come back, but it's interesting. You're completely correct, and he sees her as a kind of like punk girl, which Kachansky is not. I mean, the one thing is Kachansky is not a punk alternate chick,
Yeah, she's very different to what Kachansky was. So, it's just an interesting sort of point to note, really, sort of from a we've already sort of smashed up the continuity, but it's just something worth noting. But jump into the next episode, DNA. I'm a big fan of this episode. I really like this episode for a lot of reasons. But again, it's a very sort of Crichton-centric episode. And the general sort of push of the episode is they find a ship that has the technology to rearrange organic matter into any form. And again, it's sort of like, size doesn't seem to matter. There's no sort of like thing about actual matter, but it does it. So you're able to turn anything in any organic matter from one thing into another. And in doing so, the cat accidentally sort of traps, through a series of incidents, the cat accidentally traps Crichton in the beam. And because he has some, you learn he actually has some organic matter in his neural net. It turns him into a human, which is one of his biggest desires. And this is also one of the things we've had in the show, as I said before, sort of like that careful what you wish for. Sort of Crichton's had emotion and he sort of formed a relationship and a sort of a connection in that first episode, and he's had to give that up. And now he's actually been given one of his truest desires, which is to be human. And it doesn't go as well as he'd hoped. But what do you think about DNA?
I like it a lot less than you do, actually.
Oh, really?
I like, I think I like Camille a lot better. I think that seeing Crichton as a human is amusing enough. I don't know. I mean, there is that thing of like, you see Brent Spiner instead of Data, and you say like, oh, that's what he looks like without the makeup. It kind of takes some of the illusion away. And I feel a little bit of that. I mean, there's some humor here, but I guess I just feel like the basic setup of that device is not very interesting to me, and doesn't. It's really there just to get Crichton to be a human, and I like the Crichton as human stuff, but then they kind of like have to end the episode, and so like the mutton Vindaloo is turned into a monster, and there's a very silly monster chase. I mean, and they even like reference polymorph and say, the same thing's happening twice, as if like, yeah, we know we're kind of phoning this one in here. So I mean, I like the Crichton as human, and I think the episode would be better if they just got to that immediately and ignored everything else.
I know what you mean. Some of the jokes are. I mean, they do give the setup of the capability of the machine. They show it through. Lister gets turned into a chicken, and then they sort of make some egg laying jokes. But I don't know. There's just something about, and I think it's almost like they wanted to give Robert Llewellyn like a day off. Maybe they were like, look, we're going to give you a day out of makeup because it's we know what you're going through. And I kind of like, again, it sort of shows his range and like what he's bringing to it. Because I do like there's a whole scene of him sort of like which is silly because he's obviously there designed to serve humans and he knows a bunch of stuff, so he clearly knows how humans work because he brings them food and everything on a regular basis. but he has a series of jokes about sort of like trying to climb. It's that fish out of water thing, isn't it? Sort of like acclimatizing to having a human body, and the simple things like, well, my nipples don't work. He said, what do you mean? He says, well, usually if I twist one of them, I can get sort of like FM radio, and those jokes. And obviously, eventually, it sort of turns to what is giving him. What his lust is driven by. Sort of like he gets an erection from seeing a Hoover, or a double Polaroid, because he then takes a photo of it to show Dave, and I like all that. But again, like it comes down to this notion of sort of there's an idea that sort of like sits well with me, is this idea of authenticity, which is clearly really important to Lister. This idea of being authentic and being sort of, he sees it from a class point of view, but I am what I am, and they attribute it to Descartes, which I'm not sure is true. I think therefore I am,
right.
But it's like they attribute it to Popeye, which is great.
Yeah.
But I like the idea of this. Sort of like, because he says to him, so you're neither one thing nor the other. You're sort of struck between the two, because he goes to see his heads. And I kind of like the sort of, they give one of his heads got droid rot, and so has a sort of a thick northern accent. I don't need no bugger to come looking after me. And I like all that stuff. I don't know. I just find this episode incredibly funny. It really makes this one of those I laugh out loud at consistently.
Well, I do think the line.
I do like that.
I do think, I do think Crichton as a human works well. I don't like that he has this organic brain that you've never heard of. Obviously that's just to get the DNA device to work. He says Crichton's turned into a human. My greatest dream come true. That's true about Data. That's not really true about Crichton. I mean, he thinks he's going to Silicon Heaven, right? He thinks humans just die in their dirt, so I don't know. I mean, it's fun. I like he complains about his eyes have no zoom function. Above all, the funny line, I want to talk to you about my penis. That's coming, but the way it's delivered is just hilarious. And yeah, the spare heads do work. The idea that apparently he's been switching them out, they each have different personalities. And this has been like happening off scene through the whole show. I think I quite like.
Yeah, well, even spare hand, even was it spare arm too, is got some sort of sentience, because being left behind doesn't, it gives him the V's because it's not particularly happy with that.
Oh right, yeah.
I do enjoy that, and but the thing is, I do even enjoy the silliness at the end, the sort of the Vindaloo monster, and then turning Lister into what they want to turn him into Man Plus. They're going to try and boost him up. But basically, he gets turned into half of RoboCop, and I'm pretty sure if there are certain movie studios that were to see this, would probably be onto someone about some form of copyright.
Yeah,
but it's ridiculous. But I don't know. I just really enjoyed the end of that episode.
Yeah, I'm glad you do. I mean, speaking of authenticity, I mean, this is where I think we were talking about it on the last episode, where Lister confesses he's a sellout because he went to a wine bar,
Yeah.
Where, you're right that he seems to have this idea of class loyalty and of authenticity. I don't know. I mean, I guess that ultimately I sort of feel like, this is an okay episode that if it were, really a short about like, okay, well, we kind of have to do the android becomes a human. Here's our take on it. That would be fine. I think it goes so far off the rails at the end. I think the semi-melted tiny RoboCop is like, I don't know. I mean, it's not funny, to me. I mean, the only thing that can kill a beer, kill a Vindaloo is a beer, so he uses the beer as an explosive. I don't know. I mean, I like how off the rails the show is, but that is all off the rails in a way that I don't know. Doesn't work for me. You like the beer?
I do. I don't know why. I can't explain it. Like, it makes me chuckle now. Because obviously the thing is, he's not only is he half RoboCop, but they've shrunk him as well. So he's like the size of an action figure. And he pushes over a lager can, and he says, of course, the only thing that can kill a vindaloo is a lager. So yeah, it's not highbrow humor in any way. It's not even, to be fair, it doesn't even pay off. It doesn't even pay off the sort of the rest of the episode, really, does it? Because we obviously know that Crichton gets turned back eventually because he's Crichton in the next episode. But yeah, I like all the stuff with Crichton as a human. I really do. But even I say that some of the daftness at the end is it just makes me laugh. I don't know why it's even that when you sort of like you realise he's tiny, he's like, I can't keep up. I'm knackered.
Right.
It just makes me chuckle. Yeah, it's a silly
Well,
episode, but I do really enjoy it.
well, I think that's the great thing about silly episodes is they work for you or they don't, and
Mm-hmm.
ultimately, you know, the most you can say to criticize that stuff is like, yeah, that's silly, and I find it, it doesn't work for me. I find it more silly than landing. But I mean, that's the thing about silliness. There's so much silliness that I do like. Um, it's just idiosyncratic what works for you.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. No, but I think Denise is a good episode. But so you've had like two Crichton-esque, Crichton-heavy episodes to begin a series, really. Sort of, they're focused in on that. He's had sort of the A plot, at least of both of them. And so they pull back then, and you get so the next one, Justice, is I suppose it's more of a Rimmer. This is a Rimmer focused episode. He's got them all in, he's got them all in there, and they all get some great moments to shine. But again, the A plot really comes down to Rimmer. Um, and again, Justice is an interesting one.
Hmm.
Do you want to talk about Justice?
Yeah, well, I mean, this is also one that I remember seeing on PBS. I have very clear memories of, especially that Justice Zone at the end.
Mm.
This is in the prison ship where, and that is probably the weakest part of the episode for me. I mean, I don't know. I like this one. I like this one a lot. I don't like it as much as I do, Camille, but pretty close. I mean, I'm a fan of it. I think that if I were gonna if I were gonna criticize it, besides the sort of Justice Zone at the end, um, I mean, it literally ends with Lister falling into a manhole.
Mm.
Um, and the silliness of the Justice Zone of like whatever you do to somebody else is done to you, kind of magically. I don't know how that would work, but whatever. And it begins with Lister having space mumps and deformed cranium that like explodes and is bursts and is really gross. All of that stuff doesn't work as well for me. It's fine, but it doesn't work as well for me. But the actual penal colony and the mind probe for criminal activity, and then above all else, the trial of Arnold Rimmer.
Yeah.
That is just classic stuff. I mean, that's just,
Yeah.
I mean, what a brilliant idea to literally put your characters on trial. And literally put Rimmer on trial. And Crichton is just brilliant through all of that. So I mean, for me, that the main stuff is all just firing on all cylinders.
No, I agree. I think this is it. It's sort of like you're right, because the space mumps is um, it's like it doesn't really serve a purpose. It's almost like it's a silly idea to give them something to do. It's that gross out humor because it bursts all over the cat, isn't it?
Hmm.
Um, and so it sort of adds into that gross out humor. And I agree. I really hate the end of this episode of sort of Lister philosophizing on the sort of like the nature of justice, and then just falling down a sort of I don't know, some sort of like a manhole in a ship, which is weird. Um, and so yeah, I really I do hate that the ending, but you're right. The whole thing of sort of I actually love because again Chris Barry is so good at this. They
Hmm.
go in and they get escorted in the shoes, and they have to go through it, and sort of it's Lister that's worried because he's like, oh, we used to do all kinds of stuff when I was a kid. We used to go scrumping for cars, and I
Hmm.
stole all the furniture from a hotel room and all this other stuff. It's like, um, it's all these all these things that you're like, yeah, you are probably going to get done for. And there's Rimmer going, oh, you're in for it now, Lister. You're really in for it. And then he gets charged with the first degree murder or second degree murder of sort of however many people are credited to being on the crew of the mining ship Red Dwarf. And there's the look of panic on his face is brilliant. Yeah, it is. It's a really strong. The central concept for that is a really strong episode.
Yeah, I think that is the strongest stuff. I mean, it doesn't have that, unlike Camille with Casablanca, it doesn't have that sense of like coming together. Both like you said, the mumps is unrelated. There's this sense of just kind of, it's not as tight, but the idea, of course, it's a turnaround that Lister would get away and Rimmer would be sentenced, but the idea that this is based on a mind probe, right? And so this technology, what it's really judging is your sense of guilt, right?
Yeah.
And that Rimmer is so egotistical that he thinks he is responsible. And so using this as a way to kind of like psychoanalyze Rimmer or explore his character, that, while he hasn't expressed a whole lot of guilt over the course of the show for having killed the entire crew of Red Dwarf, it's clearly been established that he's responsible. And in this episode, Crichton says, he is clearly incompetent. He feels guilt for something he could not have done. His inflated ego is the problem. He could not have killed this crew.
Yeah, and I love the fact that they keep sort of calling, they keep trying to sort of show it's the dialogue and the jokes in it are so good. He keeps sort of the way Rimmer sort of saying, who would do this? Who would, because he keeps an objection. A man so stupid he even objects to his own defense counsel. Who would put this man in charge of any duty that would actually destroy a ship? Who? Only a yogurt. And it is this idea that, he keeps sort of, and Rimmer's, because it's really hurting Rimmer. You can tell. It's bruised his ego, and because he says to Crichton, he says, I think you're laying it on a bit thick, and he's like, no, I've got it. All hinges on me proving you're a total dork.
Right, your freedom depends on me ridiculing you and demolishing you as a person. Yeah. And that, I mean, it's just such a brilliant setup. And you're quite right that, I mean, the actors are just great, especially, I mean, Crichton just delivering those lines is fantastic. And the look on Rimmer's face, and you can understand why he would object, and the fact that is instantly pivoted and used against him, is wonderful. And Crichton finally concludes, he's only guilty of being Arnold J. Rimmer. That is his crime. It is also his sentence. Just burying Rimmer. It's so funny because it not only sort of like punches Rimmer in the guts, but stabs him in the gut and then buries him alive. It's so vicious.
It is. It's a great character piece for that, because I love the fact as well that when he's put on trial, like they give him an opportunity, and sort of Dave has put on like a badly put on tie. The cat hasn't changed at all. He's still wearing his very cool clothes. But Rimmer has sort of like orchestrated this, new uniform sort of setup as well, with his medals and stuff on and that. So he's trying to look as important as possible, but still, knowing that it's just fiction. This uniform is made up. So yeah, it's wonderful. I think this whole thing. But you're right about the rest of the episode, because they even sort of self-acknowledge it. They get back to Starbug and they're like, I don't even know why we came here in the first place. And then the mechanoid comes out and he's like, I do. And you're like, oh yeah. And they have a chase around and they enter the Justice Zone. There is something about the Justice Zone I do like. The scene when you do see Rimmer in prison and he's explaining it to Lister, and he's like, set fire to the bed sheets. Go on, just whatever you do. If you try and break the law, whatever you do will happen to you. Oh, okay. So try and set fire to the bed. Go on. So he's like, all right. and his jacket sets fire. And he's like, all right, you could explain. You could have just explained it. He's like, okay, well, right now try and steal something. He's like, no, I don't. No, I don't want to. He's like, see, perfect system. And I'm like, it's a good again another good little scene just to sort of like to hone in on an idea that this idea of the Justice Zone, which they're clearly setting up. It's that sort of Chekhov's gun because they need it to pay off for the finale. Because the only way they can defeat the Mechanoid is by sort of him beating up beating up Lister, but everything he does to Lister happens to him. And then the final joke with the cat. So it's a fine sort of like finale, but it doesn't really tie into anything. But yeah, the high point of this episode is the trial. It's that sort of like 5-10 minutes of that trial is Red Dwarf at its best.
Oh, absolutely. No, I agree with that completely. I mean, if you wanted to show somebody Red Dwarf in a capsule thing, you could show them 5 minutes from this, and if they don't like it, okay, go somewhere else. Because I mean, even if they don't understand the setup and they haven't seen the first episode, it's stated right there, in Crichton's in the trial, or if you showed them the mind probe stuff. So
yes, no, it's perfect. I mean, you've got like the first half of this season, I think, is really strong, and then you get White Hole, which isn't a bad episode, but to me feels a bit like it's almost like this is the body swap of the fourth season, to me at least. Like it's fine, but it never it doesn't really carry any weight. It's good fun, but it fundamentally, it's just a bit silly. It's a bit of fluff, really.
Mm-hmm.
The idea the concept is very much sort of like a black hole sucks time and matter from the universe. A white hole pushes it out, and so they get sort of time jumps, and they have fun with that. But then the idea of playing pool with planets at the end, I don't know. What are your thoughts on White Hole?
Yeah, no, I agree completely. I mean, it is silly. I mean, the white hole concept is silly. The whole Lister can't take that shot, at the end, is very silly. And then the paradox at the end of like all of this didn't happen, because they shut the white hole. I mean, is kind of, it's not really bad or lazy, but it's a little bit. I mean, I think what works in this episode for me is Holly having her, 6,000 IQ restored and then having to shut down and, down to 3.45 minutes of life. All of that banter works great for me. And all of the sort of dealing with the Red Dwarf not having electricity, all of that stuff is fun. It takes them 5 days to go to the cargo deck. And of course you realize how big the Red Dwarf is, right? I mean, it's a Titanic ship, but that's never shown. There's been nothing. I mean, we had that one episode earlier where we had them on an elevator. But outside of that, there's no reference to how big the ship is. So I mean, I think I love Holly desperate to not use the runtime, and I like the ship shut down. But you're right. Outside of that, I think it's a weaker episode.
Yeah, no, and I do like the moment with Holly, because they do reintroduce Talkie Toaster as well.
Yeah.
And so I'm glad Talkie's back as well, because there's a great sort of it's like when this stuff. What have you brought him back for? He won't shut up about toast, bread products, and again, like we don't want to talk about any bread products, buns, baguettes, or bagels, or anything like that. He goes on. He's you're a waffle man. It's so good. That little character is fantastic, and obviously the moment he has with Holly as well, when sort of like Holly's trying to shut herself down to save the ship. And he's like, there's one really important question that the crew are going to have to know. He said, well, what is it? Do you want any toast? Like even that moment, that's a great little moment. And so there are good moments in this. Again, like you say, it comes down to some of the dialogue. what is it? When the ship goes down and there's no engines, and sort of like Crichton sort of saying, "Can you hear anything?" And they're like, "No." He's like, Do you know why you can't hear anything? Because there are no sounds to hear." And he's right, but he could just like everything's been shut down. But it's the way they word it and the way they deliver it that is really good, strong stuff. But yeah, weirdly, this
Yeah.
is one of those episodes. This is one of the few episodes where I get bored by the end of it.
No, I think that's true. I mean, I think the sort of like pool shot is sort of tedious. And I think there are ideas like that are good ideas, like the sort of agreement that Lister and Rimmer have of sort of peddling the bike to power things like a hairdryer or to fry an egg. That they're cruel with each other about. I mean, that's a good idea, but it doesn't really it's kind of good for a lap, but it doesn't really go anywhere, or it's a kind of throwaway sort of thing. And then they have the sort of like time dilation happen where you see the same conversation over and over again as dialogue repeats. So I love that stuff, but then they very quickly say like, well, if we concentrate, we can overcome these effects. What are you talking about? And then that doesn't become important in the episode at all. I mean, ultimately, that time dilation, it's like something like Future Echoes, where my brain just goes, "Oh, smart science fiction! Like, I like that." And then it's like, no, that's not what this episode's about. Let's play pool with planets.
Yeah, it is. I mean, it's a good scene. I like the way they edit it and stuff and they get annoyed with the cat because he's sort of like, "Oh, so what is it?" Is really good. But yeah, again, it's another one where I think the payoff isn't strong enough. So it's sort of like it's a lull in the middle of this season. A very strong season, I would say, though, for the most part. Anything else you want to say about White Hole? Because there's some, because I don't think there's much to talk about in that episode. But the next two for me are really important.
Yeah, the only other thing that I remember is, about Whitehole is Kat saying, I'm not asking you to do what I wouldn't do. And like, oh no, I wouldn't sacrifice. I'd also sacrifice you. I thought, okay, I got to remember that,
That is good. I'm not asking you to do anything I wouldn't do. What, you'd sacrifice yourself for the good of the crew? No, I'd sacrifice you for the good of the crew. Yeah. So that's Whitehall. But the next two, we sort of, as I said, we opened with two sort of Crichton-heavy, Crichton-centric episodes, and we end with almost a Rimmer double header. For me, that these two episodes sort of work really well together in showing, what our Rimmer. I'm gonna say our Rimmer because what will a dimension jump of what our Rimmer and why he is the way he is, or just at least what he is. Because you get Dimension Jump, where we get to first time we get to meet Ace Rimmer, and then we get Meltdown, where Rimmer gets to actually lead. Again, like we've said in this series, it's all about what you care for, what you wish for. He gets to lead an army, and it does not go well. But Dimension Jump and Ace Rimmer.
Yes.
And again, I'm gonna laud Chris Barry. Because this is this is our second alternate version of Rimmer, and this is probably one of the strongest. And we get to see the show opens with a young Rimmer being hung upside down from a tree, and basically you find out that he's not been doing well at school, and he's either going to be held back a year, or he's going to get carry on. He's going to go carry on with all the rest of his classmates up to the next year at school. And it's obvious that decision is obviously going to be important to this show. So we then learn that there are alternate. We already know there are alternate dimensions. We've been to one already. We've been to a female. So we've seen a female version of Rimmer. And we're now going to meet a successful version of Rimmer. So a version where he has become a test pilot in the Space Corps, and he is basically sort of an incredibly sort of admired and respected pilot by other alternate versions of the Red Dwarf crew. So, what are your thoughts on Dimension Jump and Ace Rimmer?
Well, obviously classic.
Yeah.
I love Dimension Jump. Ace Rimmer is, I talked about how I was a little um uh unimpressed with the portrayal of Rimmer minus his guilt. But obviously Ace Rimmer is great. Everything sort of fires is working here. Um But I mean, Ace Rimmer's kind of like a parody of Top Gun. You even hear this kind of like Top Gun parody music. Um, and this episode really gets at, you know, obviously is having fun with Ace Rimmer, and everybody says, "What a guy!" as he leaves the room. One of the funniest bits is his boss says, propositions him. The secretary propositions him, and he says, I don't fraternize with other people in the Corps, so she resigns instantly. The boss, who's a man, flirts with him, and he says, I didn't know you went that way. And the boss says, I normally don't, but nobody can resist you, Ace. But I mean, so all of that stuff is fun, but ultimately, like some of the better episodes in this season, that it all ends up being about something, and I'm reminded of like Me Too, where you see or Me Squared, where you see this alternate self. And here, the fact that Ace, when he comes into meeting our Rimmer, the contempt that Ace has for our Rimmer and the jealousy and resentment that our Rimmer has is just wonderful. And ultimately without going too far ahead, the revelation that in that beginning scene, when Rimmer's being held upside down and, it's about whether he goes forward, that what separated those two is that Ace was the one held back.
Yes.
Boy, that's brilliant. I mean, and I love that. And I think that sometimes, I think the point is sort of sometimes the losses that we have teach us more than our victories. And sometimes, it was that humility that Ace learned. Like I'm not going to win every time. I've got to actually be good. Taught him this important point at that key point. So, it's very nurture over nature, maybe to a ridiculous point, but I mean, it manages to be an episode that's so much fun and also a brilliant commentary on Rimmer, and actually has some deep things to say about, maybe how life turns out for us.
Yeah, I agree. And, I think, as you say, the whole sort of introduction of Rimmer, of Ace Rimmer, I should say, is really good because you get the alternate versions. Again, like the alternate version of Dave Lister is, Spanners isn't much different. It's literally just Dave Lister in a different costume. I like the fact that they've gone with the cat being sort of like a relatively elderly priest, which is funny. And then, like I said, the others being impacted. But again, it's just sort of, you're right that one of my favorite scenes is that thing when he first comes on the ship, and Ace, because he collides with them, because obviously whatever it's called, the reality drive, takes him to sort of, and he collides with Starbug, and they crash, and he has to go on the ship. He says, better go down and make sure they're all right. It's the right thing to do. And when he does go down, he sort of meets him. He goes onto the ship and says, "Right, what are you going?" He says to our version of Rimmer, like, "Okay, Arn, what's your plan?" He's like, "What? I don't have a plan." "Oh, okay, well, we better go out there and get it fixed." "Okay, Arn, come on, go." So, "Well, he can't go. He's dead." He's like, "Oh, right, well, dead. Okay, well, what's the inertia rating for the engines, Arnie?" I don't know." Okay, right. Well, it's constantly he keeps sort of like handing him off. He's like, look, here's your moment to step up. What are you going to do? And he fails every time. And then the nail in the coffin then for our Rimmer is when when Ace does leave and he says, "Smoke me a kipper. Can you do that?" About the breakfast. And it is. It's a nice little dig at him. And so I love sort of like I say the dynamics of Ace and Arnie is perfect throughout this. The sort of the resentment and the bitterness, and the fact that throughout it when you do find the twist, like our Rimmer sort of like is determined and convinced that Ace got all the breaks. Like he's the one that got the good. He's the one. He must have had this. He's sort of like he's probably sort of like greased his way up the pole, and he's done this, he's done that, and da 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 da. And it's sort of like, and as you say, when you get the reveal, it's like no, Ace was held back a year. Like all that humiliation, all that sort of like the Mickey taking, being the tallest boy in the class by a clear foot. Is it's what made him. It's sort of like you say, he actually says like it made me buckle down and really pay attention and change the way he is. It's fascinating, like you say, for that moment because it could have easily been. They could have easily taken another way out and said, okay, yeah, no, he did get all the breaks and Rimmer's right. But it also, like I say, it shows that thing about perception, isn't it? About sort of what do you perceive as being good for you isn't always what is good for you. So right. I love this episode. I think it's great.
Oh, no, I do too. And that actually fits into your point about, the whole sort of be careful what you wish for. That, and I think that, that's also a part of my worldview that is very important to me, that, the things that we think would be advantages aren't always that clear of an advantage over the long term. And the things that we think are catastrophes, don't end our life and result in us making different choices. And, we wind up moving to a different place or meeting somebody else and having a relationship. And we can't imagine it having been any different. So I find it very fascinating. I think that the times we get knocked back are not as fatal as we imagine. And the times that we achieve what mattered so much to us that we felt like our whole lives depended on it, it's nice to win, but it didn't, that also was not as much of a life changer as we imagine. So, I think this works on that fun level. It is wonderful seeing Ace, confused why Rimmer doesn't volunteer. He preps surgery on Kat, and says, this is part of basic training. Like, how do you not know this? I mean, there's so much fun. It's so much fun seeing Ace Rimmer. And it's such a brilliant commentary on who Rimmer is. You really see that pain in, our Arnold Rimmer. The jealousy, Ace Brown knows his way up the ranks, and then you really see Ace sort of in pain, saying, I can't stand to be around, to see myself like that. This sort of like, I moved past this. I cannot stand to see, this sniveling, Rimmer that we know. I mean, of course, that's also funny. It's wonderful. I mean, if there's any episode that really makes you think Rimmer is just a sniveling coward and a waste of space at heart, it's this episode.
Yeah, totally. Well, I think this matched with the next one is a fascinating, analysis of Rimmer. But again, like that moment, the fact that like Ace actually admits to him, he says, there are infinite numbers of alternate realities out there, and maybe I will come across someone more pathetic than him, but I doubt it. It's interesting. I mean, go on.
Well, there's a scroll at the end that says, Ace went on to visit thousands of realities, but he never found a more worthless self than our Rimmer. Just talk about, I mean, there's a cruelty to this, but it really does hammer home, Rimmer is a kid.
Oh, yeah, totally. And I should say, one of the things we haven't sort of mentioned, but I'll pick up here is actually around this time, Red Dwarf had a magazine. They had a magazine called the Smegazine. It ran for around 29 issues across 2 volumes. And in that comic, in the magazine, they had the usual stuff, interviews and behind the scenes and reviews and all this other stuff. But one of the things, they also had a series of comics. And in those comics, there were a series of comics of Ace Rimmer's other adventures across and meeting those other versions of Rimmer. And there's one where there's a superhero version of Rimmer, and then there's sort of some other bits. So some of those comics were really good and really. I mean, they're not as solid as some of the episodes, but again, they do continue that. The expansion of the alternate versions of characters, and eventually when we get to sort of series 5 as well, they had a comic that looked at the alternative. They had a whole sort of series that ran about Jake Bullet, the alternate version of Crichton as well, which is really cool. But it's really interesting, like I said, that the Ace Rimmer character has really hit home. It's sort of like he's like a fundamental part of Red Dwarf lore. And I love that. I just love again that he's such a great character, and he does make a return in a later series as well,
Right.
which is cool.
Yeah. Well, I'm jealous of you that you've read those comics. From the Smegazine.
Do you know what? Right, I know we'll quickly talk about it now. Obviously, I contacted Rob Grant via email and tried to get in contact with them. And Doug Naylor, and sort of through different means. And they've got a production company now which works with Dave, the TV channel, UK TV, to make the current series. And sort of just a very, very brief email exchange and said, look, do you know what would be really cool? You've got these 29 magazines that existed between, I think, 92 and 94. Not all the content's great. There's a lot of sort of like filler articles and some interviews with someone you sort of like, it doesn't really matter. But there's some really good stuff in there, some really, really good articles. And then all these comics, some of it's really good. That I think is so tragic that they haven't reprinted in any way, shape, or form. It's owned by the comic series and the material is owned by Rebellion at the moment, who make 2000 AD. And I had a conversation with them, and they said they weren't really looking to publish it or republish it, but it'd be great. I just think it'd be fantastic, because one of the things it does actually that's highlighted, or not highlighted, I should say, in the show, is the comic extends you get comicized versions or comic adaptations of some of the early episodes, and what it does, it introduces some of the original concept ideas for the characters. So, for example, the fact that Rimmer was supposed to be black and white.
Mm-hmm.
As a hologram, and that's obviously how they depict him in the comics. And I was like, oh, that makes it even more interesting, because it's even more obvious he's dead then. And there's some other things like that as well, like the cat in originally some of the other iterations is a bit more feline and that sort of thing. And then obviously they use the Danny John Jules characterization. So yeah, it's really interesting. It's a really sort of they're on eBay for varying prices and varying quality, but they're interesting. It's really worth looking at, or at least grabbing a couple to have a look at. I'm intending to collect them all and then try and sort of read through all the comics at some point.
Well, and that magazine ran from 92 to 94. So,
yeah.
I'm trying to realize, let's see. So, yeah, so, right, that would have been season 5 and just past season 6. So it was kind of like starting up, right? Not that long after season 4.
Yeah, I think the first one came out just between season 4 and 5, because it had a sort of like the first couple of issues had a here's what to expect from series 5 sort of thing. So
Wow.
Yeah, so they're really good. So if anyone listening, I do recommend searching those out. They're actually really, really cool.
Well,
and they are getting harder to find.
Yeah, and I don't have them, and I'm a huge fan, and I am, apparently while it was being published, more than 40,000 people It was, had a circulation of above 40,000, but the publisher, which was Fleetway, wanted to focus on other stuff. These days, 40,000 would be, a serious comic. And I'm sure that there is an audience for this material. And I know that as an American, we never got a chance to get this material. So
29 issues. I mean, selected material from across those 29 issues in a sort of like a collected, whether it be a hardback or paperback edition, I think it would sell gangbusters. Like, it would sell, just reprint those comics with some of those articles and all those bits and pieces. I think it would make an absolute fortune. New introductions maybe by some of the cast or some of the editors. I don't know, but I'd buy that in a heartbeat.
Yeah, I would too, for sure.
Anyway, that was a little bit of a diversion there, just because I wanted to talk about Ace Rimmer. But yeah, the thing I was trying to get to is that sort of like, so you've got this sort of analysis of Rimmer in Dimension Jump, sort of as him, as you said, as a complete git and sort of a bit of a pathetic loser and coward. And then you sort of get handed Meltdown, and Meltdown is almost like, it could have. It's almost like the universe giving Rimmer an opportunity to redeem himself. Do you know what I mean? It's like,
yeah.
So in Meltdown, they come across. Well, firstly, they introduce some new technology. They have the matter paddle, which is a device that can transport. It's now introducing teleportation.
Right.
But it can teleport people, long distances. And Crichton's found it on the science deck. And so they sort of, you're introducing the sort of the Star Trekian thing of an M-class planet. They find a breathable atmosphere, with a planet with a breathable atmosphere. They teleport down to it. And this is where I get a bit confused, because they teleport down. It's still 3 million years into deep space. They teleport down to it, and apparently people on Earth have set up a wax museum 3 million years from space, into deep space. Don't know why. But they land on a planet where wax droids have broken their program and have been at war. So good guys and bad guys have been at war for thousands of years. And the good guys are made up of sort of some of the lesser. So, I don't know, you've got a Pope, you've got Santa Claus, you've got Elvis, Pythagoras, Einstein, Laurel and Hardy.
Marilyn Monroe, right?
Marilyn Monroe, I was just thinking, yeah. Mahatma Gandhi, Jean-Paul Sartre, and it goes on and on. So they're very sort of, they're pacifists at best. And then they're sort of, the villains have got sort of like all this collection of like ultra villains throughout history. Sort of like, the majority of the Third Reich, Rasputin, Caligula, and it goes on and on. It's a really weird episode, but I'm a big fan of this episode. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I like it. I don't think it's anywhere near as good as the previous one. I mean, I think you're quite right to suggest that, it doesn't really make sense that there's this, wax museum 3 million years out there. And I think that this is part of this season and the previous seasons really relaxing of sort of like, well, there are no aliens. Yeah, okay, well, there aren't. But, I mean, if it's a genetically engineered life form, it's an alien. It's just shares. It was just made by humans, right?
Yeah.
You have androids. Well, okay, depends what you classify as a life form. Then you've got like, I mean, when you've got like a pod with a, that's an escape pod from a prison planet. I mean, it's sort of semantics that, this is not a universe with other life. I mean, although I like that as the original conception of the show. Yeah, I mean, I think what's interesting here is that, you pointed out that sort of Rimmer has a chance to see whether in real life he would have been a Napoleon. And in a way he is. I mean, he takes charge, but ultimately, kills the village to save it and is perfectly happy with that conclusion. And so in a way, he winds up being, as much of a git in this episode as the previous one.
I'd say worse. I mean, in the previous one, you sort of, and I agree that like Dimension Jump is definitely a better episode. But in that episode, like you have that he is, you know, he is petulant, he is bitter, and sort of all that sort of stuff. In this, like he is willing to commit genocide just to sort of like bask in the glory of victory. Because basically what happens is he gets down there with Crichton. Because you also find out that they've now added another dimension to Rimmer as well. Is that the thing that allows him to move around is inside him, buzzing around, is what they call the light bee.
Mhm.
It's a small sort of device that projects his image, and that's how he's able to see him. So it's not Red Dwarf then that's projecting that image. It's a light bee that sort of like floats around inside him, which is quite interesting.
Mhm.
So he's able then to sort of travel as well. So they travel out his planet with Crichton because they don't need to breathe, so they can sort of check if the atmosphere's all right. And again, it's sort of this goes back to what they sort of did with Backwards, isn't it? Again, you have you have that same separation. You've got Crichton and Rimmer and the cat and Lister, and they separate them on another sort of like non-Earth planet. And again, but when they find out that there's this war going on, Rimmer steps up to take charge and lead the wax droids, the good wax droids, and basically his plan is to attack the villains across the minefield under cover of daylight because they won't be expecting it. Yeah, it's lunacy, but it's it's amazing.
Well, it is a lot of fun seeing, like, Marilyn Monroe charging with the gun, and, like St. Francis and all of this stuff. I mean, I
St.
think a
Francis
lot.
of Assisi.
Yeah, I think a lot of the fun is just sort of the fun of this mashup, and and ultimately it's Westworld, right? I mean,
Yeah.
it's what if there were a Westworld with all of these famous people in it? You have Hitler, you have Abraham Lincoln. Let's have fun with this, and it does. And Lister has a line. You've taken a group of holy men and pacifists and turned them into the Dirty Dozen. And that's essentially the premise of the episode, right?
Hmm. Yeah, and again, I think this is one of those episodes that sort of like the concept is incredibly silly, but again, the dialogue is good, and I think the cast are on form. I mean, Lister and the cat get taken captive, and one of the first things is like Lister's trying to figure out what they're all doing because he's like, "What are we doing in Nazi Germany? Where are these guys?" And then he starts to identify that they're all like from different periods and there's uniforms and all sort of stuff, and they're actually building a gallows for him and Cat, and which is great because Cat starts, "I don't want to be hung." But then they lead. So he's like, "Oh man, they're leading somebody out. There's a firing squad." And you never get to see it. The viewer doesn't get to see it, but
Right.
Lister gets to see Winnie the Pooh get taken to a firing squad.
Yeah, I know. Right.
And again, it's such a silly concept, but like Lister's reaction is like, that's something no one should ever have to see. It's little moments in this are so funny. I think it's really good.
Well, and this is, earlier I said that, like, there's nothing wrong with being silly, and it sort of works for you or it doesn't. I mean, this is for me just kind of delightfully silly. It knows it's over the top. I mean, it tells the viewer that constantly. When you've got characters being mugged by Elvis and the Pope, there's no doubt that you're over the top. But again, you were saying that this is even more sort of cynical about Rimmer than Dimension Jump. Yeah, I mean, you're right. I think that, like with Body Swap, I felt that, yeah, there's something leaves a bad taste in my mouth about Rimmer's actions in that episode. It's just a little too mean. And here, like in the previous episode in Dimension Jump, you sort of, you feel as if Rimmer is a terrible, broken person, but he's ultimately petty. He's ultimately not evil, right? I mean, he's not a menace. He's just a terrible human being. Here, he causes genocide. I mean, he kills all the goal is to turn up the thermostat and melt and literally kill all of the good guys and the bad guys made of wax. And the show knows, unlike in Body Swap, like the show knows this is abjectly terrible and Rimmer has done something unforgivable. And
Yeah.
yeah.
But they even call, I like that because again they call it out. You know they call it out at the show because he sort of they come back because again he's put himself in a sort of like a World War II sort of general pattern kind of uniform, hasn't he, sort of thing. And he marches back in because they've saved the cat and Lister, or at least they've escaped, and but he's got them tied up, and he walks in. He's like, "It's VW Day, victory on Waxworld," and Lister starts calling him and saying, "Well, how many of Arnie's army survived?" And he's like, "Well, we haven't really had time to collate all the information and all this thing, but roughly about none of them." And he says, "Well, shouldn't we go out and bask in the glory? The vile menace that plagued this planet has been beaten, or is gone." And Lister's response is like, "No, it hasn't, mate. You're still here."
Right.
And it's sort of, it's this thing that the show is willing to acknowledge that, like, he has literally just wiped out the population of a planet. Like, whether it may just have been a bunch of wax droids, but they've started over thousands of years. They've started to break their programming, and it's really sort of, again, it's one of those things that this show does that it's lighthearted and it's sort of you're not really supposed to sort of hate Rimmer that much, but by the end of this series, you start thinking, oh my God, he's actually a really terrible person. And if he had been in charge and given the opportunity, like, he would have done some terrible things.
Oh, absolutely. And there are so many episodes. It's really easy in sci-fi to just kind of elide these actions, right? To not say that it's genocide, right? Oh no, all of our, there was some plague that I unleashed and now the entire population of robots is gone, All right, well, let's move on. There are so many ways to just kind of like elide mass murder and, just kind of move on with the show. But yeah, I mean, there's no illusion here that this isn't genocide and that Rimmer isn't the villain at the end of this episode.
Yeah, exactly. Like, it's interesting because this is also the final episode, so there's no sort of like follow up to say, oh, and by the way, here's a funny episode for you to get past all that. Here's something a bit lighter. Like, they're like, no, we're going to leave you with that. Keep that in mind because we're going to get, when we get to the fifth series, there'll be further adventures. And I know that the sort of like, one of the key points of a sitcom is it's the status quo, isn't it? You reset everything. No one really changes. But the fact of the matter is, like, these actions have happened. Like, he has done these things. And so it's interesting that sort of like, when we do get to some of the future, especially in season 5, like, some of the ones in particular I'm thinking like is Hollow Ship, and we will get to them probably in the next episode now because we're running very long, but Hollow Ship and what's he called? The Inquisitor. So
right, yeah.
You get to this, there's going to be some interesting notions there as well. Again, it's the first 2 episodes, so Hollow Ship and the Inquisitor. These notions about how Rimmer sort of sees himself or and what he deserves is interesting, considering what we now have witnessed him do.
Yeah, I mean, thinking about those episodes that are coming up. I mean, one of the things that I have in my notes is a sort of admiration for the show for how much it lets its characters be just terrible. And we've talked previously about sort of different types of characters, and especially in sci-fi, of sort of relatable characters that sort of are in that Philip K. Dick mold of just like, yeah, they're kind of swarmy, guys,
Yeah.
there's nothing especially noble about them, and the truth is, those people probably are way more common than the Ace Rimmers.
Mm.
Ace Rimmer is fundamentally, he's Flash Gordon. He
Yeah.
is Adam Strange. I mean, he is the serial hero. And our Rimmer is, a lot closer to Rimmer as people really are. And yes, he has illusions of grandeur, and he is a genocidal criminal here, really. But I am always impressed with the show, and sometimes it's a lighter touch. Sometimes, like this, it's kind of like, okay, let's just kind of forget that so we can like him at all
Yeah.
in other episodes. Um, but in both cases, I have a fantastic admiration for the show and how much it allows its characters to be just petty and disgusting and, not necessarily bad, but just dumb and petty and willing to hurt other people for their own dumb reasons.
Yes. No, I know exactly what you mean. I mean, they allow them to be human. Is really, they allow them to be sort of flawed and um, in that way. And I mean, you can. It's probably one of those things you can only really ever get away with on TV in comedy. It's sort of it's quite risky, really, to be funny, and um, they have done it with other characters, but to have the whole crew be that way um, is interesting, and to have maintained it. The show has changed, shifted gear really from those first two seasons to these in particular. Um, and so it is interesting that this is this is the show. This is the show that we love. Really admire, and we're happy to admit that. Yeah, the characters in it are actually they're all pretty, to varying degrees, pretty despicable.
Yeah, absolutely. And that goes in the face of the sort of dominant thinking. I mean, granted, this is a comedy, but the sort of dominant thinking of, well, we've got to make these characters more likable, which,
Mm.
obviously in drama happens all the time. I mean, it happens in science fiction. Um, and yeah, there's more room for them to be despicable in a comedy, but and maybe the fact that they're British gives them a little more freedom there. I don't know. What do you think?
I think you're right. I mean, again, we talked about it before. This notion of sort of British sitcoms have a tradition of the bastard being the protagonist. I'm thinking sort of like Blackadder, Basil Fawlty, um, even sort of other sitcoms that are a bit more light-hearted have always had that sort of that tone. Or everything from Porridge, which was set in a prison, to a pair of grifters being Only Fools and Horses, which is a beloved sort of British sitcom. Sort of yeah, I think it's just we're sort of more accepting of watching these people. To be perfectly honest, I don't know why. It's an interesting one, but yeah, I definitely think it's more of a British trait and a cultural thing to allow to sort of accept and to see these people in these situations.
Well, it's
Yeah.
definitely something that sets Red Dwarf apart, and it is, that was one of the things that as a kid, I mean, as an adolescent, made Red Dwarf so shocking to me. That not only was this a show where the ship could explode in any given episode, or everyone could die, but um, you could I wouldn't say there was no one to root for, but you certainly were not rooting for a hero, right? I mean, there's no
No.
Captain Kirk, there's no Captain Picard, there's no Ace Rimmer. There's just people being petty, and even Crichton's petty.
Yeah, and he will become more so as the series go on, which is wonderful. And he has some great moments in the next couple of seasons. Um, but that's it. That's sort of like seasons 3 and 4. So I think really, we're taking these by a couple of seasons a block, and I think I'm really pleased with sort of with 4 seasons in, and I think I'm really enjoying this deep dive now. I'm really getting into it now. Sort of this rewatch is making me consider a lot of it again. So. Um, Yeah, so I think really the next episode will probably be 5 and 6.
Yeah, sounds good. I mean, I am enjoying rewatching them too, and I actually have never seen the last couple seasons. Um, so I will be watching those for the first time when we get to the end of our deep dive. But it's really wonderful to explore Red Dwarf again. I mean, and I have one of the reasons why you were talking about the magazine, the Smegazine. Um, I never have had that kind of community about Red Dwarf. I mean, I've been to a Star Trek convention. I mean, I can go online and find, people who are into this or that. I mean, when I don't like it nearly as much as Red Dwarf, but if you watch Battlestar Galactica, you can have a conversation with a random person who likes sci-fi and they've seen it or most of it, and you can have an intelligent conversation about that. I've never been able to never known anyone who was into Red Dwarf except, people who are like, yeah, I kind of remember that from when I was a kid. It's like, okay, all right, I know what that is. That's fine. So it is really wonderful. I mean, you are my community, Scott.
That's it. And I'm happy and I'm more than happy and proud to provide that community, because this is, I can, like I say, could talk Red Dwarf all day. And I'm sort of hoping, I mean, what this will be, I mean, this is our inter-season stuff. It's going to be almost like, for me, this is going to be like the definitive conversations on Red Dwarf. We're going into it to a level where we're 3 hours. The last episode was just over 3. This is over 3. Like, we're going to be talking like, hours of analysis on a half-hour sitcom about the last human and stuff. It's wonderful. It's so good. It's so worth it. And weirdly enough, having spoken to a few people, they're very excited to see what we've got to say about Red Dwarf as well. So I'm hoping the listeners are enjoying it.
Well, I hope so too. And don't forget, tweet at us at Pod Time Space.
Yes, definitely. Let us know what your favourite episodes are. Do you think we've missed any points? Do you think we're sort of introducing you guys to new ideas about Red Dwarf? Let us know, because I think there is a really big community for this out there, and I think let's raise the roof. If you want, I tell you what, if you want this to be collected, those comics, as I'm saying, those collected magazines, the Smegazine, let us know. Let us know if you think that should be collected and reprinted in some format, and if you'd buy it, because I think if there was some noise about that, I think Rob Grant, Doug Naylor, and UK TV and Rebellion would probably pull something together to make that happen. I really think they would, because it's a missed opportunity. Anyway.
Yeah, I agree, and I would love to. I would love to see that myself. And I know that if we exist, and there are people online who have been excited to hear these episodes, I know there's an audience for that.
Definitely, most definitely. But anyway, Julian, thank you very much as always for your time and
you too, Scott,
traveling through space with me. And, for all those guys out there, we'll catch you on the next episode.
There's something very important I forgot to tell you. What? Don't cross the streams.